Great. Well, thank you, Ray. As Ray said, I'm Steve Wills from the Insight Management Academy. I'm aware that there's a very broad mix of both buyers and suppliers of market research in the audience, and that you're spread all around the world. So one thing I would say is I apologize that some of the examples I'll be giving are quite UK oriented, but I'm sure you'll bear with that. So just to move on, today's presentation. What I'm going to be taking you through is what insight management actually is, and we will move towards a formal but I hope very simple definition of it, and how and why it has emerged as a profession. And I'm acutely aware that making a claim that this is a new and major profession is quite a big claim. But I think as we go through, I hope the arguments will become clear, and I hope by the end of it you'll be agreeing with me that it most definitely is a profession in its own right. But also what I'll be addressing is what it actually means for market research and the issue of whether it is an opportunity or a threat. And again, by the end, I'm hoping you're going to see that far from being any kind of threat, it's going to provide great opportunity. And it is certainly wholly complementary to the market research profession. So where I'm going to start is by looking very much at the big picture. Information is the world's biggest and possibly unique in the fact that it is one of its fastest growing resources. It is a fantastic resource. It has always been valued and prized. But throughout history, until really quite recently, information has frankly been relatively scarce. But what has flipped is that now suddenly we have so much of it that it has become hard to use, and information is only valuable if it gets used. Now, in days gone by, when it was scarce, it was prized, and it did tend to get used. Now, there's just so much of it, it's a commodity, it's all pervasive, and that makes it much harder to filter, to use, and to take action from, and therefore to gain value from. So what I'm going to do is take you on a journey of how and where this profession of insight management emerged. And it goes back really quite some way because we've been working on it since the late 1990s and into 2000. Just to give you a little bit of background, I'm actually an engineer by background originally. I then got involved in new venture development, then strategy consulting before running an agency that was involved in a mixture of market research and data analysis and competitor market intelligence. I suppose you might call that now an insight agency. But I want to take you to the year 2000 and the point where the slide will come up. Let's try again. And we had a client in 2000. There we are. That we were working with, and she had just taken over as head of market research at British Gas. And one of the things she said to us was, I want my research team to be best in class in 3 years. And British Gas were pretty typical at the time in that the market research team worked in a silo, as did the market intelligence unit, as did data analysis. They weren't really very joined up. But when she asked that question, the first place she went was to other heads of market research in other companies, and actually the response she got was, well, yeah, we'd rather like to know too. So it led to a dozen sponsors of major companies with quite large research teams. I think the largest was probably Nokia, sponsoring us to run a project on what is best practice in the management of market research on the client side. So there were the main 12 sponsors that had a series of workshops, but there were also over 100 other companies took part in various ways, including a survey. And one thing I'll just drop into this was that when we talked to all of those, only 2 of the people involved out of all of the well over 100 companies, only 2 had the word insight in their title. But if I can just move on, coming out of that, it was, I think, the answers won't surprise you. What emerged from that study was that market research teams at the time were great at project management. They were very good at providing data, very good at the technical and the methodological side of things. Where they were all poor is in the onward communication and actually extracting and demonstrating the value from what they were doing. So a lot of what they were doing was being wasted. Now, I'm going to say no more about the 2000 study, but what then happened was that in 2003, many of the same companies came back to us and said, we need to take the work further because now we are insight teams. I mean, coming out from all of this, we sort of date the emergence of insight as a phrase being used in commercial terms back to about 2002. And I think what happened was more and more companies had recognized they needed to bring together these silos and get them under one roof. And it needed a name, and it was given that name of insight teams. So what I want to do is just talk to you about some of the results that came out of that because they underpin everything going forward. What was interesting, again, we ran it with a dozen sponsors, major companies. We ran workshops. At the first workshop, we said, well, what's the word insight mean? And of course, everybody knew, except everybody had a different definition. And it led to something that was really quite enlightening. And we asked the question of what is insight, and we looked it up in the dictionary. And what we got was this, that insight is a penetrating and often sudden understanding, or the ability to perceive clearly or deeply. What we suddenly realized was that we weren't looking at one definition, but we were looking at two. The first is about these things, insights, that we are so often asked for. The second was insight. When somebody is deemed to be insightful, they have insight. So let me just say a little more about those. First of all, with insights, there is so much concentration on insights. I know they are sometimes the bane of people's lives. You hear stories of people in research having someone from marketing coming in and saying, I've got a meeting, can you give me an insight, please? It is a bit like that. But sometimes from even the smallest piece of work, you can pick up an insight. It's a flash of inspiration. It's that aha moment. The key to it is to recognize it and then get it to the right person who can act upon it quickly. And that, I think, was where the focus was at the time. The focus was on insights. But what we realized was that the real value comes from this thing called insight. And this was defined as the ability to perceive clearly or deeply. And what it means is it's about that body of knowledge. It's knowledge coming from many sources. It's embedded in people's understanding. And it's about having that knowledge throughout an organization so that it actually underpins all decision-making, whether or not specific research is asked for. And it is the absolute essence of customer centricity. And we were talking about saying it is about building the knowledge asset of a company. And so the key findings coming out of that study were that, first of all, insight doesn't necessarily come from just one source. It comes from multiple sources, be it market research, database, sales, finance, wherever it may come from. Each of them is only one part of the bigger picture, but the real insight comes from building those bigger pictures. But the more important bit was saying insight is a strategic asset of the business, every bit as important as is IT, for example. And therefore, insight must therefore be managed like a strategic asset. And this actually is all about a complete change of mindset, moving away from the model where, and we've been there too, a market research team is very proud of the service it gives, but it is a service mentality very often. And it has to be shifted to this point of saying, no, we are responsible for building and maintaining the knowledge asset within a company and gaining value from it. So let me just say a little bit more about that. Let's look at the role of the board. The role of the board is actually to deploy its assets and generate the highest returns. So it begs the question of, okay, what are those strategic assets? First of all, and most obviously, you've got the cash, the buildings, the physical assets. And along with that goes typically a finance director. Clearly, the people within a business are a strategic asset. That's why you have an HR director. I mentioned IT just now, and absolutely, IT is a major asset of the company, and you tend to get an IT director. And this is what we were saying, was suddenly we're saying that insights now, that body of knowledge, is becoming a major strategic asset of a business. And what it actually said to us was that back then we were predicting that what we would begin to see was insight directors on the board. We made that prediction back in 2003. We didn't actually see it happen until 2011. The first we saw was Jill Pritchard, who became Director of Insight at Channel 4. But we are now at last beginning to see more and more insight directors at board level. And I think it proves the point about how this is going up board agendas. Now, this was all back in 2003. And I mentioned that we had a whole series of workshops, but it spawned the work that has then taken this forward. Because what happened was that those companies involved in the workshops said, we want to keep this work going, and we also want to get together and work on it together. So it led to the creation of something then called the Customer Insight Forum. It's now called the Insight Management Forum. And I just want to show you, these are the current and some of the past members. There are obviously quite a lot of UK companies there, but also a great many international companies like eBay, like Coca-Cola are involved. And I actually feel very privileged that we've been working with all of those companies, and it, as a result of everybody's input, that the profession has emerged and best practice has emerged. And just to show you what's happened over the years since, we've been running typically a couple of best practice projects every year. I'm not expecting you to read this slide in detail, but these are the kinds of projects that we've been looking at over the last 8 or 9 years. What's interesting in all of that, though, is that there was not one project that was about market research, not one about data analysis, not one about intelligence practices. All of it was about the other kinds of skills and disciplines that go around it, that are all about getting information used, valuation and knowledge sharing and team structures and those kinds of things. Now, the point is that over the years, it really has been going up the board agenda, and it begs the question of what is driving it up, because once we understand the real drivers, we can begin to see this is not a flash in the pan. And so what I'm going to do is move forward from 2003 to 2005, when the forum was then established. And one of the very early interviews we had was with David Smith, who was the finance director at GlaxoSmithKline. One of the reasons we went to see him was because he had such a keen interest in insight, which was unusual for a finance director, and we wanted to know why. His explanation was that he'd been in positions, senior positions in finance for most of his working life. And throughout that time, he said, I have always been looking for whatever is going to bring a step change improvement in company performance. And what he said was that up until that point, every single one of those step changes had come from the cost side of the equation. He said if you went right back, you had cost of manufacture. In fact, you could go right back to the agricultural and the industrial revolution, to Ford and the production lines. And clearly this was always bringing the cost of goods, the manufacturing cost of goods down. And he said once we got into the sort of the 50s, the realization was that actually now manufacturing cost was an ever decreasing part of the overall cost of goods. So we started looking elsewhere. And then you tended to get these leaps every 10 years or so. There were major leaps like most sales forces got disbanded and direct sales techniques came in. Major changes in administrative efficiency came in through the things that IT could do. Major changes in the way logistics and distribution were managed. And he said that took us through to the mid-90s. And by then, we'd looked at really all the aspects of our company, and this was shared with many other companies. And they realized that although obviously they could keep bearing down on cost in all of those areas, they weren't going to get step changes by looking inwards. And it led them to then look outwards. And they looked at the supply chain, which is why in the mid-90s what you suddenly saw was the emergence of the supply chain directorates suddenly going up, getting to having board-level directors and having a very high level of importance. But this was in 2005, and what he said was, now that we've done that, we can keep bearing down on cost. I'm now looking for where the next step change in performance is going to come from. And he said, I believe it's going to come from the way that companies manage their knowledge and their information. That is the thing that is going to make them most competitive. And there were some examples of it, and one of them I'm going to come on to later. So this is one of the drivers of saying that other factors driving company performance were getting rather equalized, and insight was suddenly coming up as a very good candidate for going forward. So the drivers, low-cost differentiation was what he was talking about. Another driver of why this is happening now is the sheer volume of data and what we now call big data. So of course, if there are vast amounts of it, it's going to have a major impact. Another factor coming into all of this is company size. If you actually think back to, say, 20 years ago, 30 years ago, a big company would typically be national. It might have elements of international, but the amount of information that was needed by the chairman, the CEO, the senior executives to run it was not that great. But as companies got bigger and bigger, as they moved into more and more markets, as they had to deal with more and more cultural differences, the amount of information that is needed to run those kind of companies progressively grew greater and greater. And it's not now even the big companies, even small companies are trading globally and need really to have a good understanding of a great many different aspects of different cultures, different markets in order to operate. And so it became clear that companies needed to become better and better at managing their information if they were to remain competitive. There's one last factor I want to throw in that I think also has a major impact on why insight management has become so important now. And it's this one. It is staff turnover, the frequency with which staff move on and leave. Again, if you were to go back, say, 15, 20 years, a typical marketing director would probably have been in post for many years, have probably worked in the same company for many years, possibly all of their life, certainly most likely to have worked in the same industry all of their lives. And they would be surrounded by staff who had been there a long time. So inherently, they would have learned a lot about their market, about their customers. And so the amount of new knowledge they needed was not that great. Now it's changed. I think this is probably true in most countries, but certainly the statistic that's often quoted in the UK is that the average life of a marketing director of a FTSE 100 company is just 17 months. These people are moving on faster and faster, and they're not just moving on within the company or within their industry. For example, not that many years ago, the new Vodafone marketing director had come from Procter & Gamble. And so what you had is the situation of people being parachuted in, and what does a marketing director from Procter & Gamble know about mobile phones and about the telecoms market? They suddenly were on a very steep learning curve, and they again had to take in large amounts of information very rapidly. And that is actually true across all staff levels. I think another statistic quoted was in the States, on average, by the age of 34, someone in America would have had an average of 14 jobs. And as people move on, they move from industry to industry. There's obviously a good side to it in giving breadth of experience. But each time they move on, they take their knowledge with them. And that knowledge asset within the business decays. So the role of the insight management team has grown more and more important because all the time they're having to replenish that information. As people come in, they have to get them up the learning curve very fast, at the same time as having to deal with obviously a vast amount of changing information around them. It is becoming a much more professional discipline as we go along. I said I would mention one of the companies that's had a big impact on this, and I think I would credit them with responsibility for saying that insight management is possibly better developed in the UK than anywhere else. That's often not the case. Often trends come from the States or from elsewhere. But in this case, a number of people in multinational companies have commented that insight management skills do tend to be more advanced in the UK than elsewhere. I credit it to Tesco. Now, for those of you who aren't in the UK, Tesco is the largest supermarket company. It's the equivalent of Walmart in the States. And I want to use them to demonstrate how much insight and the insight asset is actually worth. And this goes back to actually 1996. Prior to that, Tesco's for 20, 30 years had always been in second place to the other major supermarket chain called Sainsbury's. In 1996, Tesco's was still in second place. They had an 18% market share, which was just below Sainsbury's. They had never been able to get past them. But in 1996, they launched Clubcard. Now, it was obviously a loyalty scheme, and quite frankly, their competitors were fairly dismissive of it. I think they'd all tried loyalty schemes, and it hadn't had a huge effect. The all-important thing with Tesco's was that they recognized, they knew right from the start, that this had nothing to do with loyalty. It was all about the data that they could gather, and that they could therefore use to help them run the business better. They worked with a company called dunnhumby, and I would recommend to anyone that you read there's a book called Scoring Points, which what happened and how Clubcard was developed. But dunnhumby started taking all the data that was coming from the tills and from the loyalty scheme and began analysing it. And after just 3 months of opening up the scheme, they went to see the board of Tesco's to present their first set of analysis. And this is what Ian McLaurin, who was chairman of the board, said. What scares me is that in 3 months you've learned more about my customers than I have in 30 years. And Clubcard and its data, but I should also say, also supported by a great deal of market research and other data, has underpinned Tesco's growth ever since. They overtook Sainsbury's, and to give an idea of its worth, first of all, I'd say it's certainly costing them at least 300 million or more per annum in terms of what they give out, in terms of loyalty rewards and so on. But their performance is, to my knowledge, unique. They grew their market share by 1% year on year, every year for 14 years, from 18 to 32%. And I say that's unique. There are obviously lots of companies who have grown market share quite rapidly, but typically that's in new markets. IT is commonplace, where there are lots of new players, or they've done it through acquisition. This was in a very mature market with well-established players, and all of that growth was organic. But it still doesn't actually put a number for how much that insight was worth. So let me give you a different number. In 1996, the market capitalization of Tesco was £6 billion, about $9 billion. That of Sainsbury's was £8 billion, or $12 billion. In 2011, market capitalization of Sainsbury's, whose market share had dropped a little but not much, was still £8 billion. Market capitalization of Tesco's was £36 billion. That is a very large amount of money, and a very great deal of it is down to how they manage their knowledge and their insight. And it is this that has been recognized by the boards of directors of many other companies in the UK. They've looked and said, how on earth did Tesco do that? And I think that is why perhaps insight has a higher priority in the UK than anywhere else, simply because there is this classic and very visible example. It is just worth saying, though, that it wasn't just that, and actually the insight team did not have to be particularly proactive in what they did. Part of it was down to Terry Leahy, who was the CEO. Now, he was unique in being the only one of his peer group in the FTSE 100, the only CEO who spent one day every week without fail out of his office on the shop floor talking to customers, talking to suppliers, talking to lorry drivers, to staff, getting very close. And it created a culture within the company that demanded understanding of what was really going on. What it meant was that the insight team could actually be quite service-oriented. So their mindset didn't actually have to change so much. It did beg the question of what would happen if Terry Leahy left, and he was replaced by somebody who perhaps didn't engender that same kind of culture. Well, Terry did leave a few years ago, and there's no proof of this, but maybe it is just coincidence. But since then, Tesco's performance has gone down, and in fact, recently it's had profit warnings. But this gives you an idea of some of the drivers that have been going on about understanding the importance of managing your information so well. So now I'm going to fast forward to 2012. We were working within the forum, and what the forum members were saying was that we are now recognizing this as a new profession. We are recruiting different kinds of people. But actually there are problems in that when we talk to HR, for example, they're saying we know what a market researcher is, we know what an analyst is. What is an insight manager? So they needed definition. They needed it as well to help develop their own staff in explaining what insight management was. So it led to a whole series of work. Now, clearly, prior to that, researchers and analysts were technical specialists. It was moving much more towards consultancy and the role of being business partners and so on. And it starts getting us towards the true definition of insight management. So just to crystallize it, one of the things we did was saying, well, what is the problem it addresses? And the problem that insight management addresses is this. The majority of business decisions are taken by HIPPOs. And for those of you who don't know, HIPPOs stands for highest paid person's opinion. I know we live in a world where everybody says that information should be used to support decision and we should have evidence-based decisions. In reality, it's not the case. And this is why your information has to be so well managed. When decisions are not taken in the right light, it's no good providing more and better analysis. It's about how you manage that information through the process. And I do love this cartoon. I will leave you for a moment to just read it. And as so often in comedy, it really does sum up the truth of the position, that people will talk about using data, but the reality is that so many business decisions are taken based on other factors like company politics. So it leads us towards this definition of, well, what is insight management really all about? And we wanted to keep it really simple. So we said, right, what is insight? Insight is information that can make a difference. Insight management is all about making that information make a difference. We seem to be jumping ahead, sorry. Now, one of the other things that people said they wanted was accreditation as well. We weren't in the position to provide that, but they did say we need to talk to those who can. And the recommendation was that we should talk to as many business schools as possible, not least to test out with them whether they actually supported the concept that insight management was a discipline in its own right, was a profession in its own right. And in fact, we got a very positive response, a unanimous response that definitely this was the way things were going, that business schools would begin to reflect it. And there was one in particular that already had a focus on different aspects of insight and information management, and that was in Winchester. And we started work with them, and they immediately said this ought to be turned into an MSc, a master's. It's been pitched just below MBA level. It's a postgraduate. You have to have several years of experience before going on it. But to say a bit more about Winchester Business School, it sits alongside things like the School of Journalism. There's work going on within the Finance School looking at integrated reporting, which is again about bringing information together. But even within the law school element, there is a specialization in information rights. But I wanted to show you the content of the Masters because it does actually help to define what this thing called insight management really is. And if I take you around it, the first two modules are the more broadly academic ones. The first is almost like a mini MBA. It's all about understanding how businesses work, how businesses take decisions, and where, therefore, the touch points for insight are. The second is about behavioral insight, the neuroscience side of things, which I'm sure many of you will be familiar with, but it is really getting to understand how and why people, particularly in business situations, take decisions, because if you don't understand that, you're never going to be able to influence them. Then there is one on organizational awareness, which is very much about how do you organize an insight function within a company. And it ranges from everything from the organization, from the governance, right through to stakeholder management and so on. Then the last three modules are very much about how you handle insight itself. Firstly, business issue evaluation, a consultancy type approach of really making sure that the work you do is addressing the right problem, not just symptoms. It's then that you get into insight generation, and that is actually the only point at which things like market research and data analysis actually get brought in. So you can see that insight management is a much broader discipline than just market research. And then finally, you get to things like to the insight delivery side and how you actually deliver with the impact that you want. I should just say that we're trying to support this. I'm only going to say this very briefly about what the IMA is doing. We're not the professional body as such, but what we're trying to do is provide the facilities and services that people would expect in the profession. So things like assessment and CPD, performance support, knowledge management, those kinds of things. But I think what I'd like to do is just bring this to life with a few classic examples of the visible side of insight management. The first is the story that some of you may have heard, but I always enjoy, is the one of the Dove range of products. And I'm presuming that this range of products is available under the same branding throughout the world. It was clearly a breakthrough in that it was positioned very differently to most products of its kind, in that it was not based around the most beautiful models and those kinds of things. It was based around treating women in a very different way. But Unilever, who developed it, clearly developed hundreds of new products every year, most of which will never see the market, and even those that do, many will fail. The key to running an FMCG company is that you have to be very good at identifying the failures and weeding them out. So they have a very clear set of rules that have to be followed for any product to reach market. Now, the product developers and the researchers who were working with Dove knew that they had a success on their hands, but they also knew that Dove, for a variety of reasons, like, to be honest, I don't know the details, for a variety of reasons, would not pass the tests that were necessary within Unilever to get to market. They broke through by showing the board a whole series of videos about of women talking about the Dove product. Now, that in itself was not so unusual, but what was unusual was that the women talking in the videos were the wives, the daughters, the granddaughters, the nieces, the female relatives of the board members. Suddenly, there was an emotional engagement. Suddenly, the board members could see why this was a product that was so different, and it broke the rules. They therefore went ahead and launched it, and it's been a fantastic success ever since. I'd like to give you another example. This one is not from the world of marketing. This actually comes from finance. And it's the lovely story of the glove shrine. This actually was a guy called Joe Steiner. Now, he worked in financial analysis in a major manufacturing company. They had a global presence with lots of subsidiaries, but quite disparate purchasing processes. Now, he did all the analysis work to demonstrate that they could save a great deal of money if they got their procurement processes in order. He actually had the figures to demonstrate they could probably save as much as $1 billion in 5 years. Now, you would think that kind of message would get through. But for whatever reason, because of maybe the politics of running a whole range of disparate companies around the world, the senior management didn't want to address it. His way of getting through to them was that he took one example, and this was industrial gloves. And they had 452 different contracts for buying different types of industrial gloves. But in fact, most of those gloves fell into 5 or 6 different sorts, and many of them, although on different contracts, looked and were to all intents and purposes identical. So what he did was that he got an intern to get one pair of every single type of glove that company bought, and he then attached luggage labels to them showing where it had been bought and how much it was bought for. And this was the kind of disparity that they could find. And he created a room at their headquarters called the Glove Shrine. He put all 452 pairs of gloves in there, all labeled, and he simply invited the senior management to come in and take a look. When they saw it expressed in this way, suddenly the message got through. They recognized they had to do something about their procurement processes. And in actual fact, the Glove Shrine went on a global tour to demonstrate the point to people. One last example I want to give you is to demonstrate that this isn't just about getting information through and used by senior managers. And I want to give you the example of Barclays Bank in the UK. Like so many companies, in their canteens, in various areas throughout, for all levels of staff, they have televisions. And very often those televisions are showing things like CNN or BBC News or whatever it might be, interspersed maybe with some product promotional material perhaps. What the Insight team did, though, was that they created their own TV channel, in effect, called Insight TV. It consisted of a whole series of regularly updated short videos of customers and prospects talking about financial products, talking about their worries, their fears, what they felt about the economy, those kinds of things. And therefore, that information, those videos are being shown on TV screens throughout the company. And it's helping to generate this thing I talked about very early on, about customer centricity, making sure that people in all walks of life within the bank took decisions with at least a realistic understanding of what their customers were like. And perhaps the people who were most distant from those customers were those who were working in their headquarters in One Canary Wharf in the City of London. And this last picture, and I'm sorry it's not particularly clear, in One Canary Wharf, they even have televisions in the lift. But by having those small videos about customers being shown regularly in the lift, it means that people who almost literally live in an ivory tower and are the most distant and possibly have least understanding directly of what the customers are like, we're having it said all the time, and it has helped to change the culture within Barclays. So, we're getting near the end, and we get to this question of, is it a true profession? Now, I clearly believe it is, but one of the discussion groups that was put on LinkedIn started, and it begged the question of, is insight management really a separate profession? And one person very sensibly came up and said, well, I'm not sure it is. It's certainly an occupation, and that I would agree with. Absolutely, it is an occupation, and it can take you to board level. But challenged it on the grounds of saying that all the major professions actually demand many years of academic work and the accumulation of specific knowledge in order to achieve qualification in that discipline. And it is true to say that at this point, that would not be true of insight management. But having said that, it is becoming more and more academically rigorous, and already PhD research is being planned at Winchester, and the academic base for insight management will grow. So I think it qualifies on those grounds. But I think there's a more important ground that you have to consider, and that is whether the profession has a social purpose and value. If you look at the law, clearly it underpins civilized society. Medicine, it's pretty obvious. Accountancy is there. If we didn't have it, we couldn't have the kinds of national and international trade that we have. I actually believe on this count of all, insight management potentially is one of the most important professions of the lot, because with the phenomenal amount of information that we are now capable of generating, all of that information has huge potential value to the world and to society and to companies and to organizations. But we are only going to actually reap the benefits of that if we learn to manage that information properly. And because of the sheer explosion in the volume of information, I think on those grounds, insight management is going to emerge as one of the major professions of the world. That then begs the question of what does it mean, though, for market research? Is it an opportunity? Is it a threat? I think that market research certainly does face some threats at the moment. I would summarize the most important ones as these, though. It's certainly not from insight management. There is the threat of displacement by big data. And although certainly all of us within the industry know the importance of market research, it is true to say that a lot of the market research industry financially is underpinned by large-scale quantitative research studies that are actually just generating the kinds of data that probably can be and will be substituted by big data. So that certainly is going to be a threat. This is also leading on, it is linked to big data. As people talk about it more and can demonstrate what you can get from big data, I think more and more market research is seen as this thing of the past. Certainly if you talk to students at universities about careers, talk to them about market research, there is this image of it as being about people with clipboards. It's not exciting, whereas things like big data really does excite them, especially when you talk about things like data scientists. I think also there's a threat from things like neuroscience, because we now know a lot more about how human beings make decisions, and we can understand why what they say and what they do can be so very different. And again, as more people understand that, more and more people question the validity of research. Clearly, for us within the industry, we understand the value of research and how we are responding to those challenges. But in the outside world, I'm not so sure that's the case. So I believe those are the big threats to market research, certainly nothing like insight management. On the contrary, I think insight management is going to present huge opportunity. And in two ways in particular. The first is career development. I was talking about students coming into the industry. I think when we start talking about insight and insight management, it will excite them more. If somebody is very able, aiming for the top, I don't think they're going to say, I'm going to get to the top, and one place I must go to is the market research department. But there are people now saying, if I'm going to get to the top, I need to understand insight management. So I think it's going to help bring talent in. There's also this point that it is the role of insight managers to look at issues and work out what information you need to get from where. And it is from that side that insight managers will actually be the greatest supporters of market research, as having its place wholly valid alongside things like big data in giving us the information we need. So insight management, I think, is going to help and support, and we certainly must support the market research industry. But I still say that insight management is in itself a wholly different discipline. So that's what I was going to take you through. I throw it open to you. Does this raise any questions? Do you agree? I would love to hear.